Um, we have about 10 minutes. So I have some questions for you guys, but I would love for any of you guys have questions for us, for me, for Jay, for Chassidy, about content, historical, pedagogical. I like to throw it open at the beginning for anyone who's got something burning you want to talk about. You can just unmute yourself and speak up.
Yeah, I was curious. We saw the price of cotton plummeting.
Mhm.
How much did the farmers get charged to gin their cotton?
Depends who's ginning it.
Okay.
So the way it worked, there was a little discussion in the chat that I jumped briefly in on about cotton gins, but going all the way back to Stephen F. Austin's colony, like that was a way to make money. People would bring in cotton gins. They start small, kind of hand cranks, but pretty soon by the 1840s, 1850s, they become these three-story beasts essentially that are being run with horsepower. And whoever invested and built that thing not only can make money on their own cotton, but for ginning the cotton of their neighbors and things like that. So people would charge that. And then after the Civil War, you've got groups that come together that are running cotton gins, and they might charge a certain rate, or you might have a neighbor who's got it, charges a certain rate. But that's part of the cooperatives we were talking about, is that they wanted to run cotton gins to charge lower rates than, somebody in the neighborhood who happens to have the only cotton gin in the entire county. That guy can charge everybody everything. So it fluctuated wildly throughout this period, depending on who was doing the ginning and also how far that gin was from, say, the rail lines or anything else, because you might also be charged for shipping back and forth to that. So it's a good illustration of just how much you could get nickeled and dimed on your cotton, literally and figuratively, throughout this entire period. Um, and you can see the remnants of this on the landscape today because there are cotton gins everywhere, old cotton gins, and parts of near the rail lines usually is where they were established. So these cotton gins, as the rail lines expanded, typically got built up bigger ones near the rail stations themselves because you would gin it right next to the rail lines and then put it on the rail lines and ship out from there. And so some of those cotton gins were actually owned by the railroads too. And so you can see the confluence of opportunities for the railroads to really gouge you if they wanted to.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question, Todd.
To piggyback off that, how did they compress the cotton? Was that added to the ginning process since they were able to make this big beast of a machine?
Yeah, it was done at the gin. I love the mechanics of cotton. I find this stuff fascinating. But they'd run the cotton gin, and then you have the lint, the actual cotton as we see it, fall down, and then that would get compressed into these blocks. And so what they had um, in the 1850s, these were made out of wood. Later on, these are made out of metal of various sorts. But basically, you got this big block, and they just shove cotton lint into there. So think of your dryer lint. You just collect that, shove it into a big box, and then they had these big presses that would come down and just compress it down into these blocks because cotton's pretty fluffy, and that's adorable. But if you're trying to ship it, you want to save as much space as possible. They would compress that down, and then you would bale it and tie it down essentially. Um, Oh, let's see. Ken has just posted something in the chat about personal experience in Hale County with cotton gins. But anyway, you'd compress it, and then it would get baled essentially and shipped out from there. The cotton bales at this time are about 450 pounds, and even today, I believe they're usually around 400 to 500 pounds or so. We have a pretty similar quantity of cotton in any given cotton gin.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, I got a question for you guys then. Um, Besides time, so I'm taking away your easy answer. Besides time, what is the biggest challenge in teaching this kind of content to your students?
So I think making it real. So I think my philosophy is that once students can have like a something tangible to connect with their learning, that it's like, whoa, like this is a reality. So for example, like I'll bring cotton, like raw cotton,
Mhm.
with the seeds, and I'm like, this used to rip people's hands, and like they're touching it, and they're like, whoa, like that's why the cotton gin, is gonna expand the spread of slavery. And I think the biggest thing is just make them be like, oh, this is just the crop. It's like, well, no, like there's more to it, like and I think once the hardest thing is just capturing them into like how we've been doing for the past couple of weeks, that it's all interconnected. So
Totally. Yeah.
like I really like the sessions, because it's cool that now as we're going into this unit in the next couple of weeks, letting them know it's like it's an ongoing process, and that it's
Yeah.
all connected.
Well, that's the question I want to ask you guys. How do you engage? Because I've seen in the chat, like engagement. Engagement is the secret sauce of all education. And if they are bored, it matters not, right? But if we can make it interesting somehow, or they see themselves in it somehow. So how do we do that with cotton? I mean, I love what you're saying, Lorenz, about bringing in actual cotton and getting your hands on it. I do that when I teach my Old South class, absolutely. But how can we do that with cotton here? I want to hear some ideas on that, besides just showing them pictures of bales that probably don't mean anything to them.
I mean, if no one else is gonna speak, or go ahead.
I was just gonna say, if you had them look at the things that they're wearing, their socks,
Yes,
shirts, or their jeans,
exactly.
and then they're like, how many of you actually are wearing things made of cotton or partially made of cotton? Where do you think that comes from? And then
Yeah,
you keep
they're all going to be wearing cotton shirts,
right, t-shirts are made
clothing.
totally cotton, so
Absolutely.
it's a staple of life. And yeah, I think
Yeah.
that'll get them a little bit interested in what they're doing, maybe. So,
It'd be really interesting to take. I don't know if you guys do this in your classroom, but like in my classroom, what I've done more than once is like take the modern cotton production system. I spent
Mhm.
5 minutes just explaining how their shirt got on their back,
right,
and just sort of like seeing it as a big system. And it's like, whoa, and I'm wearing this. Like, okay, how people in 19th century or 20th century wore cotton. How did it get to them? It's basically the same system, but on a smaller scale, and it's closer to home. And then suddenly it feels like, oh, it's not coming from India, the cotton. It's coming from Texas or northern Mexico. Coahuila produces an enormous amount of cotton. And
right.
like, I love the idea you guys are saying about connecting it to them somehow and making it feel real and not just like farmers I've never heard of are upset. Okay, that's their problem, not mine.
So my great grandparents were farmers in Texas, and I have my great grandmother's journals.
Oh, wow.
And my family's even old 300. So every little bit I've been showing them, like, hey, here's a photo of my family member. And we've just kind of been marching them through Texas history.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so the journal I have is of my great grandmother, and she's talking about what it is to be like the wife of the farmer. And
Mm.
so it's been really interesting that that's the one the kids could care less about the populist. And so even
Totally.
James Hogg and Ima, it still's not getting their attention too much. But seeing my great grandmother talk about how hard things are, that for the kids has been huge, to just make a physical
Mhm.
connection of
Mhm.
here's my teacher, this is her great grandmother. So it's real people, and that's what's helped us the most.
I think it's brilliant. I think it's absolutely brilliant. I love that. And I love that you have to think like at the outset about how you're going to tie back into that later. So like you lay the groundwork or the threads of cotton early on that you pull in later. I think it's a brilliant idea. The other thing I was thinking about as you guys were talking about this is like we can tie it to cotton, but we can also tie it to poverty. And I mean that in the sense of like explaining like if the money you make goes down by 85%,
Yeah.
we can illustrate that pretty effectively. Like, what would you do? And then you ask for help, and you can't. When you could break it into smaller examples for the students, but talking about like something they're familiar with, which is having money and being able to buy things, and suddenly that being taken away on a massive scale might also give them some sort of sense, I guess, of how the farmers are feeling in all of this. That's the thing that's hard to capture, but is so important because there's this like constant anger the farmers are feeling that ultimately erupts in the populist movement that we'll talk about next week.
Right.
And then
Go ahead.
I think it's really cool how Ashley was saying how she has actual documents, because I think it all goes into like those primary sources. Because I had a student ask one of the greatest questions I've had. I mean, I've only been teaching for about 2 years now. And she asked me, "How do we know that what we're learning is even real, sir?" And I was like, and we had a whole dialogue of, the historical process, and really showing them that this is why we look at these things, because when you can make it real, it's like, wait, this is not just our teachers just make these things up, but we can go back and look at the pictures, and we started observing, like, it's just like all the light bulbs and the gears start turning. They're just like, whoa, like
Yeah.
this is real. This is not just some made up thing. But once you understand the historical process and the creation of history, like it's a lot more real once they have these discussions.
Well, when it seems like it's enmeshed in someone's real life, right? And so like what Ashley's doing with her family, I think makes it real, because there's her teacher who's related to these people. Like that's really powerful. Or as you're saying, Lorenzo, the primary source material where you have like pictures that Chassidy was bringing in, or primary sources that Jay and Chassidy are bringing in, like stories from people's lives. I mean, we can't give them like reams of it, but like little insights in can bring in some interest and some sort of connection. And then I saw a few things in the chat I just want to point out. Like the other thing too is that, especially in rural communities, some of these kids do have experience with rural life in a way that might also, have overlaps that'll be powerful ways for them to see connections in the material. So anyway, we are out of time. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I play a game with the kids, but it's really more with sharecropping, where they get a certain amount of beans, and we talk about, okay, now we're going through the year, you need to buy for clothes, and they keep losing beans. And then at the end, they have to pay, the landowner half of their crop, and then they end up in debt. And so then the kids realize,
Mhm.
that it's hard to
I love
survive.
how tangible that makes it too. Because then, it's so obvious to them. Exactly. I love that. All right. Well, we're going to come back to this topic next week, so we get to come back to our discussion. So we'll put a pin in it for now. Angry farmers, and then we'll see their efforts next week.